This playthrough is rated T for teen.
Chapter 8, Mysterious Client, Los Angeles, December 25th, 1980, 11 a.m. His head pounded. All those drinks, so full of Christmas cheer at the time, were making their after effects felt in a decidedly unpleasant way. As he lay there half awake, he could still hear that song, Promise, that was on Sydney's record. It kept repeating over and over again in his mind. Slowly he forced himself to rise from his bed. When the cold morning air brushed against his skin, the hangover started to fade just slightly. Before going back to his room the previous night, Hyde had staggered all the way to the hospital where Ed was recovering. In a stroke of luck, no one was there to see him when he went into the ward. Ed was lying, sound asleep in that dimly lit room. He looked tired somehow, stretched across the bed like that, world-weary. Hyde left as silently as he could so as not to alert Ed to his presence. He knew his boss would prefer not to know Hyde had seen him in this state. It was hard to make himself wake up properly. He kept remembering how he'd knocked back all those drinks. He noticed that the rain had stopped. It had started raining in the middle of the night, but the skies must have cleared at some point. The raindrops, still left on the window pane, were spread out into beautiful patterns. He gazed out beyond them at the misty, still damp cityscape. As he stood by the window, Promise continued playing in his mind. The melody from that old record provoked a lingering feeling of nostalgia that he couldn't shake any more than he could get the tune itself out of his head. Only one explanation. I must have heard it somewhere before. He placed himself down on the sofa and tried to remember anything he could. He knew that deep in the recesses of his mind was a memory that related to the song, but all he had to do to latch onto was this one tiny sliver. Little by little, his memory of that night 25 years ago started to come back to him. That song, Promise, had been playing on the radio that rainy night when he and his mother had just moved to Manhattan following his father's death. He'd been woken up by the sound of the rain, and he'd gotten out of his bed and peered through the window. The glass was fogged up from the humidity in the room, so he had to wipe it clean with the sleeve of his pajamas. He stood on his tiptoes so he could see out properly. Outside his window, the towering skyscrapers had a purple glow to them. This was the first time he had ever looked out over the Manhattan skyline. He wanted to show his mom as well, so he went into her room. But when he opened the door, she was already standing by the window. Kyle and his mother had both been looking out at the same scene. "Isn't it pretty, Mom?" His mother said nothing. She just silently put her arm around him. A song was playing quietly on the radio next to her bed. She told him it was a song his father had loved. That song was Promise. It wasn't just the first night he spent in Manhattan. It was the first time he saw his mother cry. Suddenly, the phone rang, jolting him back to the present. "I see you're at home." It was his mother's voice. The trimming was almost eerie, like his thoughts had summoned her. "I'm not calling for anything in particular. I just thought it would be nice." He thought he could hear a twinge of loneliness in her voice as it reached him through the receiver. He hurried to come up with a suitable response. "Got your package. That baseball was the one Dad bought me all those years ago, right?" Jeannie was pleased that he still remembered something like that. He could tell that from her tone of voice as well. When he was very young, Hyde had dreamed of becoming a professional baseball player. Jeannie explained with a nostalgic warmth that her husband had wanted that too. Hyde asked her about the key that had been included on the baseball. He hadn't recognized it. She replied that it was in the briefcase that his father Chris had been found with after he died. The police had given it to her 25 years ago, and she still didn't know herself what that key was for. However, she wanted Hyde to have the items Chris had been carrying at the end. Then Hyde asked a question that had been on his mind for some time, but which he had never had the courage to form into words before. "Why did you ever get with a guy like Dad? He was in a less than respectable career, so why did you agree to marry him?" "I fell in love, that's why. I loved your father." She adopted a serious tone and explained how they had met at the hospital where she worked, and the relationship between nurse and patient had blossomed into love. "I suppose it's a classic love story," she added. Sensing the frankness with which she answered, he asked her what he wanted to know the most. When did she first learn that his father had been a safe cracker, and why didn't she make him stop doing it? Jeannie told him as clearly and concisely as she could. She first learnt Chris's secret 2 years after Hyde was born. Chris had wanted to wash his hands of the whole business now they had a family, but his associates hadn't been happy with that decision. "So he just kept on cracking safes?" said Hyde, raising his voice unwittingly. "How can you just forgive him like that?" He lashed out, unable to contain his fury. He couldn't understand why his father would have continued his criminal activities. Hyde's sudden anger left his mother stunned for a moment, and then she continued talking more quietly now. "When you're ready to forgive your father and me, perhaps then we can continue this conversation. Merry Christmas, Kyle." Once she had said that, she ended the call. He kept the now silent receiver pressed against his ear for a few moments longer. He debated in his mind whether the conversation had really been for the best. He longed to ask her these questions about his father, but now that he finally had, the achievement rang slightly hollow. It was too late to take back any of his words, but he couldn't bear the thought that he had caused his mother any distress by dredging up these painful memories. The buzzer sounded, and when Hyde opened it, he was greeted by none other than Tony, the same Tony had been supposed to spend Christmas Eve with him, but had heartlessly blown him off when Betty arrived to whisk him away into the city's bustling nightlife. Still, Hyde invited Tony into his room. His own night hadn't ended up so bad, as he explained to Tony. He had stayed in the cafe with Sydney, and they kept drinking until closing time. It had been pretty good. In return, he asked how Tony's night had gone. It was pretty obvious that was what Tony had come here to talk about. Surprise, surprise, Tony was eager to boast about how they had spent half the night chatting and getting out of control. Hyde was about to make some sort of joke at Tony's expense, but then Tony's expression changed to a slightly uneasy one as he began to recount what Betty had said to him the previous night in her drunken state. Betty had said that there were two guys she liked, one who set sparks flying and one she cared about in a different way. He said what she had asked him. What do you think you do? What do you do when there's someone that you really care about who's close to you? You know, someone you've been friends with for a while? How do you tell them about how much you care about them without them freaking out? The other guy's history now, and I want to take it a bit further, but Tony seemed anguished as he continued. I started thinking, is there any chance that friend could be me? I didn't ask her, though. I chickened out. He seemed only faintly hopeful that this possibility might prove to be true. In fact, even though Tony himself had been the one who suggested the possibility, he immediately said he was probably just jumping to conclusions, and his features creased into a frown that suggested he was extremely doubtful. It was difficult to know how to lift his friend's spirits, but Hyde did his best. Maybe you're wrong, maybe you're right, but for now you should stick to the belief that she was talking about you and try to become that kind of person to Betty. Only one way to be sure, right? Tony perked up right away. As he was leaving, Tony got out a notebook that Betty had given him. She had told him it was something Rex had left behind. Hyde was eager to take it, and Tony gladly passed it on to him and returned to his own apartment. Hyde opened the notebook at once and began poring over the pages. One particular set of notes jumped out at him. 1967. Condor disappeared. Jack Green disappeared. Jack Green. A name he had never heard before. Who was it? His thoughts were interrupted by the telephone ringing once again. Wishing he could be left alone for even a second, he resentfully picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was faintly one he was not averse to hearing. It was Rachel, calling to give him good news about Ed's condition. He had made a dramatic recovery. And I know what you're going to say, sweetie. You want to go and see him, right? But I still think it's better to wait for a while. Ed wouldn't want you to see him before he's back to his usual self. Hyde couldn't lie to her. He confessed he had snuck in the hospital room after getting thoroughly plastered on Christmas Eve. What are we going to do with you, Kyle? Oh well, I guess it could be our little secret, Rachel scolded him playfully. In any case, Ed was to be discharged at the weekend, which was good news. However, the doctor had apparently told him not to push himself too hard and avoid any unnecessary stress that could put a strain on his heart. So I guess that means we better not give him too much trouble, mused Hyde. When he found the right moment, he steered the conversation towards the research he needed her to conduct into the mysterious association of Rex Foster. I need you to look into someone going by the name of Jack Green, who was under investigation by Rex. He may have disappeared off the grid after 1967. Rachel left him with a promise that she'd look into it right away and get back to him as soon as she knew anything. Now, next thing on the list, giving that record back to Sydney. He headed down to Lucky's Cafe where he found Sydney standing over by the sink. With a broad smile, Hyde started off by thanking him for the previous night. Sydney thanked him in return, saying that he had had a really good time as well. He followed up by asking, "Did you listen to the record?" Hyde answered somewhat ruefully, "It's not the kind of thing I usually listen to, but the song's nostalgic to me. Thanks to your record, I had a bit of a sentimental moment alone in my room." A satisfied grin found its way into Sydney's face, and he remarked that sometimes that could be good for you. Then suddenly his entire attitude turned on a dime, and he bent over to whisper directly into Hyde's ears, "The conversation I had with Miss Patrice yesterday, you know, not to tell anyone about it, right? She doesn't want to stir up any trouble before she leaves the place." "No need to tell me twice," he replied. Also, Sydney began introducing something else about he needed to consult Hyde about. His daughter, Claire, he explained, hadn't said a single word to him after she'd gotten home from the night before. "I want you to find out what the problem is. Would you mind speaking to her on my behalf?" Hyde was assured he was the best person to try and deal with the young woman's feelings, but Sydney looked so full of fatherly concern that Hyde couldn't very well deny his request. He decided he wanted her to have at least a little chat with her, and he took a peek into the billiards room where she was in the process of cleaning. She came across as dispirited, just as Sydney agonizing had suggested. "Claire," he asked, "are you still worried about your dad?" He was wondering if the matter she had discussed with him the day before Christmas Eve was bothering her.
Did you get around to asking about it, Mr. Hyde? Did you find out there's someone special in his life?
Hyde told her that he hadn't gotten around to asking him outright, but he'd gotten an impression from the way he was acting.
So what you're trying to tell me is that you didn't ask, right? I'm not interested in maybes. I need to know for sure.
Claire seemed to be losing patience, and the reason soon became clear. Hyde listened as she told of how she hadn't gone out to meet a friend last night at all. Unbeknownst to Sydney, she had actually met up with her mother, and her mother had dropped a bombshell. She was planning on moving to Boston. Hyde surmised that her despair all centered on the fading possibility that her divorcing parents might be able to rekindle their relationship. Claire went on with her story. She had appealed to her mother, asking if there was any possibility the two of them might get back together, but her mother's answer had been a disappointing one.
Dad has to stop her, said Claire. This really is his last chance.
There was a ray of hope, however. Claire's mother had said that she still loved Sydney. It was Lucky's Cafe she couldn't go back to. For Claire's mother, Lucky's Cafe evoked a tumultuous mixture of different memories, some good, some bad. She hated even having to think about the place. The memories were just too much for her. The bad memories were related to Sydney's loans, said Claire.
Mom hated the idea of borrowing money from Miss Patrice, but Dad did it anyway. In fact, Mags was the one person in particular that she didn't want him to borrow money from. That's what eventually led them to breaking up. And before I came home, the last thing Mom said to me was that Dad still hadn't repaid all the money he borrowed.
So maybe it was hopeless after all. Realizing this was what had left Claire feeling so crushed. Claire told Hyde about the first Christmas after the breakup. Sydney had come home slightly drunk, and when he saw that Claire had waited up for him on her own, he had put his arms around her and said, "Claire, we'll find happiness together, just the two of us, I promise you. And we'll be happier than we've ever been before." So Claire started thinking of how she could help her father find happiness.
I dreamt about getting Mom and Dad back together so we could all live happily ever after. I suppose I just let my imagination get the better of me. I should have known it was never going to happen.
Hyde suggested that if they really still loved each other enough that they could put the whole ordeal in the past, it wasn't outside the realm of reason that her dream might become a reality. I heard him say last night how much he still loves your mom.
Do you still think there's still a chance? Do you think they still love each other enough?
Claire looked Hyde directly in the eye as she asked him. Yeah, and I'm sure one day they'll be able to tell each other that. Until then, the best thing for you to do is keep that smile on your face and stop sighing. Hyde's words seemed to work as he had hoped. A wide grin spread across Claire's face. He left her in peace and went back into the cafe, where he'd found Sydney waiting for him with an anxious expression on his face. Well, what your daughter worried about is the love between a man and a woman. About what? Sydney hung his head. I feared it might be something like that. Laughing, Hyde warned him against jumping to any conclusions. He clarified that wasn't Claire's own love life that she was having problems with, it was her parents. She was hoping for them to get back together so they all of them could be happy. Sydney's expression turned a conflicted frown. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Hyde and nodded slowly. Taking a deep breath, Hyde posed the tough question he knew he needed to ask. What's happening with the loan for Mags? Sydney took a moment to consider his words before replying. He explained that he hadn't had enough money to open a cafe in the first place, so Mags had been kind enough to lend him the money. In 6 months' time, he had finally finished paying her back. The reason she had been willing to lend him so much money, Sydney went on, was that he had known her late husband, George Patrice, had been a regular customer of the Hotel Cape West. George had apparently been a saxophone player in his youth, but by the time Sydney met him while working as a waiter at the hotel restaurant, he was a businessman who owned several eateries around town. George was a wealthy man, and whenever he stayed at the hotel, he gave very generous tips. As a result, all the waiters jostled for the opportunity to serve at his table. Sydney was no exception. And naturally, he had been there when the big party was held, said Sydney. The party called Scarlet Star. Scarlet Star was the name of a party? Asked Hyde, caught off guard by this revelation. He needed to know more details right away. This can't be a coincidence. It turned out that the Scarlet Star was the name of a party that had been held at the hotel every month on a date which the number 6 was in. Sydney wasn't sure why exactly, but other parties with the names Gold Star and Silver Star had also been held on dates with the numbers 3 and 9. Next, Sydney began to provide a little bit more detail about Mags. She'd always been there, arm in arm with George, the beautiful Margaret Patrice. She had been the real star at these parties. Her looks had turned every head. When the band started playing, she had stepped onto the dance floor. Her elegance and grace had never failed to draw attention from all the other guests. A nostalgic glint in his eye, Sydney reminisced about how the Patrices were the couple everyone adored and aspired to emulate. So how come Claire's mom didn't like her? Asked Hyde. Choosing his words carefully, Sydney told Hyde that 13 years ago Mags had been arrested under suspicion of murdering her husband George and been put on trial for it. Sydney believed she was innocent and continued to profess her innocence even after he was questioned by the police.
But that didn't matter. That didn't matter to my wife. She was convinced that Miss Patrice was guilty, and we had a big argument about it. Things were never quite the same between us after that. Sydney's eyes darkened. Then the jury returned a verdict of innocent. From that point on, my wife was sure that Miss Patrice and I had something going on, meaning that when I borrowed the money, she refused to forgive me for what I did. But I wanted to run my own place so much. By the end, he was practically choking the words out. Hyde listened closely as Sydney's true feelings revealed themselves. I love her, and there's no denying it. I just haven't got the confidence to tell her. He said that he blamed himself for their breakup. I was such a fool. I didn't notice how my wife was feeling until she left me. So I'm afraid that if we did get back together, I'd just do the same thing all over again. I'm sure she wants another shot of happiness too, though. Said Hyde. He wasn't just saying that what Sydney wanted to hear. No, he meant every word. He told Sydney all about the chat he had with Claire. She had never forgotten the promise she and Sydney had made to find happiness together, and Claire's idea of happiness was having her family back and all living together. Finally, he said, It's not my place to stick my nose into your business, but I'll tell you this for free. There aren't many families that can get back together, and most of them who tried fail. Hyde left Sydney on the note and went to pay Mags a visit. He couldn't shake the things Sydney had told him about her from his mind. He had to ask about the man, the one who would undoubtedly have been present at the Scarlet Star parties held during the days when the apartment building was still a hotel. He had to ask about her husband. She answered quickly to his knock at the door. He wasn't quite sure how to begin, so he rambled slightly. You see, I'm a big fan of jazz music, and I often listen to it in my room. The best kind of jazz always features a saxophone, don't you think? The second that he mentioned jazz music, he could see that he had captured her interest. And ever since you mentioned that your husband played the sax, I've been intrigued. Would you be so kind as to tell me a little bit more about him? She was happy to do so and invite him inside. Hyde started up asking her when he had started playing professionally. He was already part of an established band at the age of 20. He was into jazz from the day he was born, and he taught himself how to play. Mags wore a warm smile as she thought back to her late husband's younger days. There was a cheerful quality to her voice as she went on to answer his next questions. What kind of person had he been? He was a real gentleman, both masculine and invigorating at the same time. These qualities guaranteed him a hit with the ladies. As she spoke, she seemed to be looking far beyond him into the distance. He posed her another question. When did he throw in the towel and stop playing? Mag's eyes widened in shock for a moment. He asked her again in a way that might have seemed too much like he was pressing for information. Well, he went on to run several eateries around town, didn't he? And he was a regular guest at the hotel restaurant here too, right? Her expression grew cold as steel, and she insisted he tell her who had told him all that. Staring right back at her, Hyde told her that he had researched into her husband himself and found all about the court case as well. Mags made no attempt now to hide her disdain. Why she demanded in an accusatory tone was he digging up information about her husband. He replied that he had simply been interested to know more about the master of jazz that was her late husband. Plus, he was interested in her because she was a widow, just like his mother. She laughed out loud. So you know everything, it would seem. What's so funny? Still trying to contain her laughter, Mag started to come clean. I have things in my past I would be happy never to share with anyone, and I was planning on keeping it that way until we'd all gone our separate ways. Yet, as the day we all leave draws ever closer, you choose now to suddenly develop an interest in my past. I just found that very interesting. As you may know, I was held on the assumption that I murdered my husband. That incident, she explained, occurred 13 years ago. One day, a burglar came into the house where she and her husband lived, and she was struck by the burglar and knocked unconscious. When she came to, her husband was dead, and in her right hand she was clutching the gun that had been used to kill him. She was charged with murder, but the court declared her innocent. However, the real killer was never apprehended, and the case remained unsolved. She used the money he had left her to buy Hotel Cape West. I wanted to own the place he'd held so dear when he was alive, and that, Mr. Hyde, is all this lonely window can tell you. Hyde felt that her words rang true. Just then the phone rang in the bedroom. Mags halted their conversation for the time being and took a deep breath. As she left the room to answer it, she asked Hyde to wait a moment. While she was gone, Hyde looked around the room. Various photographs were dotted around. One such photo was of a man playing the tenor sax. It was Mags's late husband, George. Another frame held a picture of a young man and woman signed by George and Margaret. Resting on her chest was a necklace with a rather unique design, shimmering light reflecting on it in every direction. Next, his eyes fell on the frame beside it, which held a photograph of two young ladies dressed in old-fashioned dancers' outfits. It was hard to tell, but he guessed that the one on the right was Mags. She had Mags's features, only much younger. Hyde faintly heard Mags finish her phone call, and then she came back into the living room. He tried not to look like he had been staring at all her private photos while she was gone,
but he did point at the picture of the two dancers hanging on the wall. Is that you on the right? He asked. She nodded in confirmation and added that the person with her was a good friend of hers from back when she was a dancer. Mags was a dancer? Well, that certainly tied in with the story Cindy had told him. He pointed at the next photo along and asked, when was this picture of you and your husband taken? It was just before we got married, Mags replied with an air of longing for those lost days. She drew attention to the unusual necklace, explaining in a bright tone that it had been a present from her husband, one she still wore to this day. I love this picture of us more than any of the others I have. I'm sure your mother has one of her own that she values above the rest, too. Upon hearing those words, it occurred to him that his mother actually didn't have a single picture of her and his father. Suddenly, Mags bent down and clutched her head in her hands. Hyde rushed over to keep her steady. In a muted croak, she said, My head, it hurts. I'm sorry. I sometimes get like this. It's my reminder of the events that took place during that awful time 13 years ago. It's probably best if you leave, Mr. Hyde. I dare say I won't make such good company in the state. But please keep what I've told you to yourself today. Hyde left to find Dylan staring at him in the face. Dylan asked what he had been talking to Mags about, and Hyde, who by now was getting very tired of this sort of thing, replied rather bluntly that he had come to talk to her about moving out. Dylan didn't like that at all and barged past Hyde into Mags' room without so much as a goodbye. Hyde's pager alerted him of the need to call Rachel, so he headed back to his room and dialed the number for Red Crown. Rachel had an update for him about Jack Green. She had managed to find his name in the obituaries in 1967. It said that Jack Green, a 30-year-old reporter, died in a car accident due to major internal complications and blood loss. Turned out that Jack Green had been a reporter for Los Angeles Beat, the same magazine that Rex Foster had worked for. Furthermore, the two of them had worked in the editorial department together for 3 years. The most interesting part, Rachel continued, was an article Jack Green had been working on before he died. It was about the organized crime group Condor, and the title was The Truth Behind Condor, but his work came to an abrupt end due to his premature death, resulting in only the first part ever being published. Hyde needed to know what was in that article. He asked Rachel if she could get a hold of a copy for him. There was one more detail that stood out, said Rachel. That Jack Green's fatal accident had been taking place on a road leading between the Los Angeles Beat Company building and Hotel Cape West. That is interesting. Before hanging up the phone, she relayed a message for Hyde from Ed. He said there must be some kind of clue that connects the guests who attended the regular parties held at the Hotel to the Scarlet Star. What was it Sydney had said? Every month on a date with a 6 in it, a party called Scarlet Star would be held, and Mag's late husband had never missed them? Then Hyde remembered the old photo album he had found on the 4th floor. He scrambled to get it out and open it. As he thought, there were various photos stuck inside it, and that looked like they might well be from the Scarlet Star party. Preserved in the older photographs alongside with the other guests was a useful Mags, wearing the same necklace. Hyde realized for the first time that she must be able to tell him more than she let on. Guess it's about time to have a chat with her about the Scarlet Star business. He went out into the hallway and found himself quite literally bumping into Charles, who was coming out of room 205. Mr. Laws, Charles explained in surprise. Hyde wasn't in the mood for any games. Room 205 was vacant, so what was Charles doing in there? Suspecting the man of foul play, Hyde pushed him back into the room 205 and shut the door. Spit it out. How come you didn't give back the spare key? What were you doing in there? Feeling very much like he'd been backed in the corner, Charles hunched over and he confessed that he'd been in there writing a screenplay. He wanted to use that particular typewriter no matter what. It was a typewriter that Charles's friend Billy had left behind after he moved out of this room. Now that his friend had become a famous Hollywood writer, he felt like his script was sure to get picked up if he wrote it with the same typewriter Billy had used in his early days. The typewriter held something of a legendary status, at least for Charles. Furthermore, Charles had convinced himself that he wouldn't get the full effect of the mysterious typewriter unless he wrote his screenplay in that very room. Charles had personal reasons for wanting to succeed so desperately. He is currently studying at a university in LA, but his grandfather decreed that if he couldn't make his name during his first year, he would have to return to France to take over the family business. In order to achieve success, he would have to win the screenplay competition he was entering. It was his first, last, and only chance, he insisted. There was more. Charles told Hyde that he was planning on using their apartment building's secrets as the basis for his script. What do you mean, this building's secrets? Charles explained that he had first heard about Cape West before he'd come to study in the U.S. When his grandfather told him about the hotel where a still unsolved murder case occurred 13 years ago, that was what he wanted to write about. His working title was Door to the Past. The story was to involve an incident that happened long ago at a derelict hotel finally coming to light. The criminal was the person who had worked at the hotel's front desk, and it would turn out that he had hidden the evidence on the 4th floor. Charles explained his plot with a triumphant smile. The part about the evidence being hidden on the 4th floor had caught Hyde's interest, and this did not escape Charles. I know what you've been up to, you know. I know that you sometimes go up and have a look around the 4th floor, but don't worry, I've been in there lots of times too. It was all in aid of researching a screenplay, Charles explained. But he hadn't just looked. He had taken an 8mm camera up there as well and done some filming. And I got something interesting too. What do you suppose it was? Charles seemed very intrigued to hear Hyde's answer. For his part, Hyde was quite eager to know more about this 8mm film. He was certain that it showed on his face, but Charles would only reveal all if Hyde agreed to his condition. Hyde would have to admit his own reasons for snooping around on the 4th floor. Same as you, he answered as the two of them ascended the staircase on their way to Charles's room. He was curious about the incident that happened in the hotel all those years ago, and he was eager to see the 4th floor rooms that had been left completely unchanged since then. Charles wanted to know more why exactly Hyde was so preoccupied with this matter, and Hyde disclosed that he was a former detective and that his connection to this incident went back many years. As he spoke, he felt his detective instinct still present in the every fiber of his being, even 4 years on, flare up like a blaze. When they arrived in Charles's room, Hyde tried to hurry things along. He needed to see what was on that 8mm film. Looking at the image carefully, there was definitely a person visible. That meant someone else had been prowling around on the 4th floor. The image wasn't clear enough to make out who it was, although Hyde did notice that they were wearing a wristwatch. There just wasn't enough to go on, but if they had gained access to the 4th floor, it surely must have meant it was one of the other residents. At this point, Charles noted that this wasn't all he could offer. He had also taken some photographs of the hotel for inspiration. In doing so, he just happened to capture some of the residents on camera. He sped into the bathroom to development, but he was crestfallen to discover that the lamp he needed to develop my photos had burnt out. Hyde felt certain he'd had something in his apartment he could use as a substitute, so he made a trip back there and hunted around. That was it! He spotted the wine bottle Mila had brought him and still surrounded by its beautiful red wrapping. The wrapping was made of a translucent film, so it could easily be placed in front of an ordinary light to create a makeshift darkroom. He went back to Charles's apartment. There was a light above the toilet in his bathroom, which seemed perfect. They covered it in wrapping, and in an instant they were ready to develop photos, a deep red glow seeping into every corner of the room. Charles started making the necessary preparations. Hyde's job was simply to follow the instructions from Charles. He took the printing paper, putting it into the liquid sitting in the tray. He then moved it around until the image appeared on the paper. Once the picture was clear enough, he took the paper out of the tray, and then he was finished. The most important detail, Charles had told him, was the amount of time the printing paper was left in the development film. It couldn't be left in there for too long or taken out too hastily, but Hyde felt like he'd done a decent enough job. Hyde's first ever adventure into photo development was a success. He developed the newly developed photographs to the 8mm film and determined the other person who had been on the 4th floor was Will White. What the hell is he doing on the 4th floor? What do you think? What do you think he was doing up there, though, Mr. Hyde? Would you like me to go and ask him? Hyde figured that if Charles went to ask him, he probably wouldn't give a straight answer. It was best if he went himself. I'll get to the bottom of this, don't you worry. It decided there was no time like the present. He made for Will's room in seconds flat, with a mind to pose the questions directly. But when he knocked at Will's door, he received no response. If you're looking for Mr. White, came Charles's voice from behind him. He hasn't been home since yesterday. Charles had come after him and was speaking as if he had expected Hyde to have known that already. Mr. Hyde, I know you told me that you're going to look into him and his activities, but does that mean you're just going to meet up and ask him a couple of questions? Some detective. Okay then, wise guy, retorted Hyde. What do you have in mind? Torture? Possibly unaware of what an irritating impression he was putting across, Charles retained his usual haughty tone as he started to boast that he knew a lot about Will's comings and goings. Will White came home only occasionally, but there was a visitor who came to his room on a regular basis, and when Will was back, he often went out late at night. He was clearly no ordinary salesman. Continuing to put on airs, Charles suggested in a whisper that his idea for how to proceed was to pick the one lock using some way I have look in this side of his room. Charles didn't waste any time. He instantly produced a piece of wire from his pocket and shoved it into the lock on room 306's door. Charles, stop! He cried out just in time. The door opened and Dylan stepped out of room 306. As the three of them stood facing each other, time seemed to stop for an eternity. After a moment, Hyde couldn't bear it and broke the silence. Dylan, what were you doing in room 306 while no one was home? He responded matter-of-factly that Will had asked him to turn the water off while he was gone, so he had entered using a spare key. Now his work was done, simple as that. Hyde expressed some skepticism. Wouldn't it have made more sense to leave the water connected until after Will moved out? Dylan had no time for Hyde's insinuations. Mr. White had asked him to turn off the water, he said, and he was just doing as he was told. As he watched a rather flustered Dylan stride off into the distance, Hyde's suspicions remained unquelled. Hyde and Charles looked first at one another and then at the door. It appeared that no breaking and entering would be required at all. In all his haste, Dylan had forgotten to lock it. Charles was eager to seize the opportunity and burst in right away. Hyde would never let the potential risk stand in the way of his curiosity, but he also wasn't about to let them be caught. He told Charles to stand guard while he went inside, and they decided on a signal in case it looked like might be some trouble. If anyone was coming along the corridor, Charles would knock on the door to alert Hyde so that he knew to keep the noise down. When the danger had passed, Charles would knock again. Once the details were hammered out sufficiently, Hyde stepped into room 306. It was a dry, soulless room. Hyde could hardly believe it was someone's home. He started poring over every corner of the room, doing his best not to make a sound, but a piercing ring of the telephone suddenly broke the stillness and made Hyde jump with a start. He instinctively held his breath. The answer phone started, recording. "Guess you're not there, so I'll just relay this message." It was a deep, threatening voice. "The goods have been obtained in the same way as usual, and the money is in the usual place." Not a second was wasted. The moment the caller had started his purpose, he hung up. What goods? Hyde wondered, and what money? There was definitely something fishy about this. He decided he'd better search as thoroughly as he could before anyone found him there. There was one item of interest that stood out to him. A black briefcase that was sat on Will's coffee table. It was locked, however, so Hyde had no way to uncover the secrets that might lie within. Just as he was pondering this, a knock sounded from the door. Charles whispered him a warning as well. Just as they had agreed, Hyde froze to the spot, not risking even the slightest movement for fear that it might be detected by whoever was outside. A second knock came, and Hyde breathed a sigh of relief. He resumed his investigation. Will's closet, situated in the corner of the room, was fairly small, but there could still be anything hidden inside. Hyde opened it quietly, so as not to let it crack. Inside was a suit jacket. He hesitated for a brief second, but then he steeled himself and reached a hand into the pocket. Scrambling around, he grasped into a small item, which he retrieved and examined. It appeared to be a magnetic key of some kind. Perhaps his detective senses told him the key for the briefcase. He went back over to the coffee table and tried it out. Success! The briefcase opened without a hitch. Inside was a notebook, which at first glance looked very promising. He focused all his attention on reading the contents, hoping to glean whatever he could. A note in it read, "You'll find information on the item on the right of the third floor display case. The guards changed at 10 p.m., and the alarm bell at the door is an old type. We'll communicate using the usual means. Check the mirror." Hyde was baffled. Check the mirror? What was that supposed to mean? He put the notebook down and cast his eyes across the room. It was then that he noticed the mirror in the corner. Just like in his own room, it was above a small wash basin. Nothing about it seemed out of the ordinary. Also in the briefcase was a letter set. His eyes widened as he realized the writing paper and envelopes were exactly the same as the one that had been used for the anonymous order sheet. He put the paper and envelopes in his pocket, reasoning that they might come in handy later. Next, he wandered over to the mirror to take a closer look at it. Everything still seemed perfectly normal. For lack of a better idea, he tried turning on the hot tap, just as he did every morning in his own room. Lo and behold, the steam left a faint trace of some numbers on the surface of the mirror. 836601. He looked around to see where he might investigate while he still had the chance. He realized he had only opened one set of closet doors, so he peeked around onto the other and noticed a safety deposit box. Looking at the keypad for a moment, an idea popped in his head. He tried entering the numbers that appeared in the mirror. The safety deposit box opened with a clunk. Stooping to peer inside, he realized what the contents were: a roll of banknotes and a passport. All traces of his reticence were gone now. He practically ripped open the passport to see who it belonged to. The photograph inside was clearly Will's, but he looked more closely and saw that the name written on the page was Will McGrath. Hold on a minute. I thought his surname was White. Hyde paused for a moment. McGrath. He knew he had heard that name somewhere before. Then it came to him. Wasn't it the same name as the owner of the Hotel Cape West? The ominous knock echoed from the door again. Footsteps grew louder and then softer, and Charles knocked again. Hyde realized his heart had been pounding rapidly in his chest and gave him a moment to calm down. Not too long, though. His suspicions towards Will were mounting, and he might not have much time left. He went back to the briefcase to see if he could find anything else incriminating. He spotted a camera. Actually, he realized it was a children's toy camera. He turned the dials on the back of it, and after he heard the shutter release several times, the film case opened. The only thing inside was a torn scrap of a postcard. The picture was hard to make out, but it appeared to be a drawing of the night sky. On the edge was a name signature, Michael McGrath, manager, Hotel Cape West. Why would he be hiding something like this? In a toy camera of all places. And at that exact second, when all his doubts and questions were starting to form tangibly before his eyes, he suddenly felt a gun in his back. "What the hell are you doing here?" The voice was as cold and hard as the weapon pointed at his back. Hyde didn't turn around. He knew that any sudden movements could prove fatal, and trying to keep his voice leveled, stated, "Just having a look at your room. Do you mind? I need to find out exactly who you were." And when his captor tried to question him further, he said, "If you want me to talk, how about putting the piece down?" The pressure disappeared from his back. Hyde turned around to find himself enduring Will White's glaring eyes. Hyde explained how he'd managed to get into the room, and Will, hearing Dylan's part in all this, was quite shocked. He had never asked Dylan to return the water off in his room. "Anyway," he said, "why were you in here? What were you expecting to find?" Hyde just answered, "I'll talk if you will, Mr. McGrath." Will was taken aback, and then, with a sigh of resignation, he congratulated Hyde for his detective work. "Was it you that sent me the order sheet?" asked Hyde. Will curtly admitted, in no uncertain terms, that Hyde was correct. If he knew about Red's Crown's less publicized business, Hyde asked, why send an order directly to him? Will just smiled wryly and said, "It's more interesting this way." Hyde got the impression that Will had actually been trying to avoid putting himself in any danger. He needed to know more, and despite being caught trespassing, he wasn't about to go on the defensive. "This is your passport, Will McGrath. That's your real name, isn't it?" He also presented the postcard scrap he had found, and this bears the name Michael McGrath, the same name as the husband of the murdered victim Kathy 13 years ago. He was the manager of the hotel at the time. "Why did you try to hide in such a thing?" It was just as Hyde had suspected. Will had been deliberately trying to hide his true identity, particularly from Mags. In truth, he was Will McGrath's son, of the man who owned Hotel Cape West 13 years ago. The murder victim, Kathy McGrath, was his mother. As for the postcard, Will explained, it was something his father had given to him before he passed away. He looked Hyde straight in the eyes. The two of them had shared very similar experiences, he remarked. Both of them had suffered the death of a parent at the hands of a killer. Hyde's father had died 25 years earlier, Will's mother 13 years earlier. Both cases remained unsolved. But as he continued, Will seemed to not be regarding them as equals, but to be looking down on Hyde. "However, though our pasts are distinctly similar, we have adopted different approaches. You were once a detective, yet you choose not to look into your father's case. You even happen to be living in a place that may be able to shed some light on things, but you do nothing. You're not even trying to find out the truth, and I found that very irritating. That's why I chose to point you in the right direction." Will was practically spitting at this point. Until now, it never occurred to Hyde that the order sheet might have had some noble intentions behind it, and yet a tiny voice in his head whispered that Will had no right to interfere, that it was perfectly all right for him to deal with the past in whatever way he saw fit. Still, he understood where Will was coming from. "Will, who was it that killed your mother?" When Will didn't answer immediately, Hyde added, "Was it Miss Patrice?" Will's rage started to bubble over. "She was the accomplice. I moved in here and put myself in a position to take revenge on her. I originally intended to crush her throat with my bare hands. I want her to own up to her crimes and show me how repentant she is." "Then do it yourself. Don't involve me in your dirty work." "You still don't get it, do you?" said Will. "It's much more fun to have someone else do it." Will was showing his true colors at last. Hyde thought the man was despicable. "It's not like you didn't take that order sheet willingly. No doubt you've been having the time of your life roaming around the building, reliving your glory days. It didn't take you long to realize that if you found the Scarlet Star that went missing 25 years ago, you'd be able to uncover the truth behind your own father's murder, too." Kyle's emotions were in turmoil. How did Will even know about what happened to his father? He asked exactly that, and Will stated that he'd heard it directly from one of the people who had been present at the Scarlet Star party 25 years earlier. He couldn't mean. Hyde ventured to guess and turned out to be correct. His father, Michael McGrath, had confessed everything to him. It was 3 years ago, just before he passed away, and the two of them had met for 10 years. "He was dying and in need of my support," he said, with face creased up with anger. With his last breath, Michael had said to his son, "The one who killed your mother 13 years ago is a man called George Patrice. There's no evidence, but I know it for a fact." Then he had given Will a torn postcard and told him that everything had started 25 years ago when the Scarlet Star disappeared, when a certain man stole it from the hotel safe. But before Michael could utter the name of the safecracker, he had slipped away. Earnestly, with a hint of sadness in his voice, Will said that it wasn't how his father had wanted to go, and after spending the time to look after his dying father, he had had a sudden change of heart. "I used the partial hints that my father left me and started to piece it together." So, the incident that happened 13 years ago relates back to another incident from 25 years ago. After his father's death, Will had made up his mind. No matter what, he would uncover the truth his father had only been able to hint at. And through his research, he came to learn that George Patrice had already died and that the hotel had been sold to his wife, who had converted it into apartments. But that wasn't all he discovered. In a startling coincidence, it turned out that the son of the man who cracked the safe 25 years ago lived in that very same apartment building. But how did you make the connection? Asked Hyde, paying close attention. How did you know that the person who cracked the safe was my dad? I had my methods, and when I realized that, I knew I had to find a way to make you start looking into things. But it seemed I underestimated you. Before you unearthed the truths about Miss Patrice and the Scarlet Star, you discovered the truth about me. Will had a certain unpleasantness about him, the stench of a criminal. Now Hyde knew for sure. The fact that Will had been investigating him, the fact that he'd known about Red Crown's secret business, all of it was down to Will's criminal connections. Will continued his explanation. He wanted to discover the truth for himself, but there was nothing he could do anymore. You found me out so easily, after all. If I attempt to delve any further, I fully expect Niall to come back knocking at my door. Did you just say Niall? Hyde's jaw dropped. I did. You're quite familiar with them as well, aren't you? They were involved in the incident that occurred 25 years ago. This building, he went on, clearly bore the mark of Niall's influence. If I ever even so as much tried to uncover the facts behind their operation, I'm a dead man, all things considered, he said in a businesslike manner. I think it's time for me to release my grip. And as long as I'm alive, there's always a chance I can know the truth someday. But for the time being, I value my life above all else. Even if you never find out the truth about what happened to your mother? Will was visibly troubled by Hyde's question. Since he had never revealed these secrets of his to anyone before, he had never had to answer these kinds of personal questions either. With a sigh, he conceded that if he never found out, it would be incredibly painful for him. But that, he said, was exactly why he didn't want to take the revenge on Mags anymore. He knew it would take more energy than it was worth, and it would get him no closer to finding out the truth. The real question is, what are you going to do now? Asked Will. As long as that order remains valid, I'll do what I always do and track the item down, and the reward that waits for me at the end is more than enough to keep me going. Hyde's answer was as much for his own benefit as for Will's. Will gave Hyde the old postcard Michael had given it to him on his deathbed, said Will, and it was supposed to be a vital clue in finding the Scarlet Star. With a brief goodbye, Will left Hyde alone in the room. Hyde stood alone for a few moments, gazing at Will as he walked away. Will carried himself with a somber manner about him that Hyde had never noticed before. He lived his life alone, never allowing anyone to approach him. This was neither the true face of a salesman nor the true face of a criminal, Hyde. It was the deep loneliness of a son who had lost both of his parents. Hyde couldn't help but wonder if Will would ever be able to have a normal life. He had lived alone, dedicated himself to this burning need to exact revenge, and now he had thrown all that away. Would he ever be able to stop pushing people away? There, alone in the room, Hyde let out a heavy sigh. When he got outside, Charles was waiting for him, an expression of deep worry on his face. Hyde did his best to calm him down and managed to elicit a half smile. He told Charles he had found out that Will was related to the murder victim from 13 years ago, and that, from what he had surmised, Will would not be coming back to Cape West. In fact, it's probably best if you just forgot all about him. Charles' eyes still seemed to be full of questions, but he obediently spared Hyde of them. I see. Thanks for the advice. I'll steer well clear of him. And he silently returned to his room. Uncovering Will McGrath's real identity brought him one step closer to the truth behind his father's death. But Cape West still lay beneath the shadows of two dramatic events: a theft that occurred 25 years ago, and a murder committed 13 years ago. As the morning light glowed faintly in the distance, the two shadows were staring to converge. But there's still far too much I don't know, he muttered under his breath. Notes concerning Kyle Hyde, Part 8, View from the Roof. Kyle Hyde has a special affinity for the rooftops of buildings. Every apartment he's ever lived in has had a rooftop you could walk out onto, and he has always tried to find hotels fitting that description while away on business trips. Having realized this, I decided on one occasion that the best way to uncover the reason behind this might be to ask the person who knows him best. I conducted a telephone interview with Rachel, his colleague at Red Crown. Kyle's a fan of rooftops? You know, I never really thought about it, she giggled, slightly upon hearing my question. But when you put it like that, I guess you're right. Whenever he went on a business trip, he'd ask me if I could find him a hotel with a bar and a rooftop. This one time I went out for dinner with him, and he told me that he does what he does at night when he's away from home. Always the same, he said. He goes to the bar, drinks 3 glasses of bourbon, then, if the weather's good, he stumbles up to the roof. Then he just stands there and looks up at the stars. And you know what he told me? He said it's like you're just a little bit closer to the stars, and that I should try it sometime. You know, now that you've reminded me, maybe I will. Might give the bourbon a miss though. Kyle told Rachel another story about that evening, and she was kind enough to relate it to me. When Kyle was a kid, he used to stand on his apartment balcony every evening and wait for his mom to come home from work. From up there, he had a good view of the bus stop where she got off. But one day she was late, and he waited there so long that it got pitch black.
But when he looked up from the balcony, he could see the stars in the sky. He forgot all about the bus stop and just stared at them, completely distracted. He told me that when he came to his senses, his mom was home already, and she was next to him on the balcony with her arms around him. She told him that one of those stars up there was his father, and that he was always watching him from up there in the sky. That was the only time Kyle ever talked to Rachel about his childhood. Kyle's never talked to me about his past all that much. Honestly, I don't feel like it's that big of a deal. If and when he wants to talk about it, that's up to him. As she told me all this, there was something about Rachel's voice that had an intangible kindness and calming quality to it. There was one more person whom Kyle had discussed the matter of rooftops, his neighbor at Cape West Apartments, Tony Wolf. So one night, I forget when it was, but I think I was having trouble writing a song or something. Yeah, that's right. It was real late, too. After midnight, I went onto the roof for a change of scenery, hoping it'd help me get my groove back. And you know it shows up as Senior Hyde. I was just leaning with my elbow against the railing, staring into space. Didn't even notice he was there straight away, you know. Then he kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said hi. I totally wasn't expecting it, and I somehow ended up losing my balance and falling backwards a bit. I was pretty scared there for a moment. Thought I was going to go overboard for sure. But Hyde grabbed my arm tight and pulled me back up. I mean, he saved my life, but it's still pretty dangerous. That night, Hyde told me a story about when he was a cop. He traced this criminal onto a rooftop, and the guy ran right to the edge. It was about to jump, but Hyde persuaded him not to, and managed to arrest the guy instead. He made a connection to him right there on the roof. As stories go, it was kind of gritty, like you'd see in a cop show. The guy was chasing was a 3-time killer, and he had a gun. If Hyde had made a single wrong move, got him too excited, it could have gone downhill and fast. When Hyde told me all that, I thought, man, this guy really is a detective. Before that, I was always thinking as if I was a guy like that could be a real cop. You know what else he said? Whenever he goes up onto the roof, he always remembers the day he arrested that criminal and what he was like back then. He said that when he thought back to his days at this reckless daredevil cop, he kind of liked the memory of it. Sounds like he was pretty cool back then. As I listened to Rachel and Tony's stories, I felt reassured of my initial deduction that Kyle is fond of rooftops. They hold a greater significance in him than simply the beautiful scenery that can be viewed from them. When Kyle stands on the roof, he sees something else entirely.